The briefcase clicked shut, 40 refugees huddled in darkness 200 meters away. Sudanese soldiers would begin their patrol in 17 minutes, and Gad Shimron had just gotten word the boat wasn't coming. This was a night number 147 of the most audacious intelligence operation of the Cold War, a fake diving resort on Sudan's coast that would smuggle 3,000 Ethiopian Jews to freedom before it all came crashing down. One wrong move meant execution, one informant meant international incident, one suspicious neighbor meant 8,000 people died in camps while the world looked away. The Land Rover's headlights cut through the darkness at 3:13 in the morning. Shimron killed the engine 200 meters from the beach and sat in complete silence. The Red Sea lapped against the shore, but underneath came voices speaking Amharic and Tigrinya. He counted at least 40 people down there in the dark, all waiting for a boat that was now 17 minutes late. Shimron was 34 years old, spoke 7 languages, and had been running this route for 6 months, extracting Ethiopian Jews through hostile territory. Every run carried the same calculation. Sudanese military patrols swept this coast twice nightly, and one Egyptian radar operator paying attention meant everyone dies. A shape emerged from the darkness. Shimron's hand went to the Beretta 92 under his seat before he recognized Ferida Aklam. Ferida was 19, spoke 5 languages, and had walked 370 kilometers to reach the refugee camps. His 3 sisters hadn't survived the journey. He knocked twice, the signal meaning the group was ready. Ferida leaned close. The refugees had been hiding in a wadi since yesterday morning. No food for 36 hours. 2 children showing dehydration. 1 old man named Yosef running a fever. They couldn't go back to the camps now. If the boat didn't come, Yosef wouldn't survive another day without water. The plan was brutal. If soldiers showed up, Shimron had 30 seconds to drive north before they set up an ambush. The refugees would scatter. Most would be caught. Some would die of thirst. The ones who got arrested would eventually talk about the European man who'd promised them passage to Israel. A diesel engine rumbled out on the water, 23 minutes late. After 90 seconds, Shimron saw it. A fishing dhow running without lights at 8 knots. The boat dropped anchor 47 meters offshore. Shimron waded out first, feeling the shock of cold against his legs. He reached the boat and climbed aboard to confirm the arrangement with the captain, a Somali named Garad with scarred hands. Garad confirmed the payment, 2,500 now, 2,500 at the rendezvous point, where an Israeli Navy missile boat waited in international waters. Shimron handed over the cash. "No one gets left behind," he said. "If anyone drowns, the second payment disappears." The refugees started coming through the water, and the operation immediately fell apart. Children panicked, clinging to their parents and screaming. One woman carrying an infant slipped under, and 2 men dragged her back up while the baby shrieked. 4 men carried Yosef through the waves while he mumbled prayers. It took 11 minutes to get everyone aboard. Every minute was another chance for a patrol to notice something wrong on a beach that should be empty. Shimron climbed the rope ladder last. As he pulled himself onto the deck, he heard a vehicle engine on the coast road approaching fast. He turned and saw headlights maybe 2 kilometers away. Military trucks used this road. He could see 2 vehicles. Sudanese soldiers patrolled in pairs. One with infantry, one with a mounted PKM machine gun. The dhow's engine coughed and caught, black smoke belching from the exhaust. Shimron pulled out his Beretta and chambered around. Ferida stood beside him as the vehicles reached the beach and stopped. Doors opened. 6 men, all armed with AKM rifles, one pointing at the dhow and shouting orders. The first gunshot cracked across the water at 3:37. The round zipped past overhead, warning shots or bad aim. The dhow was 170 meters offshore now. More shots followed, maybe 15 rounds. The refugees screamed and pressed themselves flat. One woman prayed in a loud, keening voice. Garad kept the throttle wide open. 300 meters out, the shooting stopped. Shimron told Garad to kill the running lights and maintain heading due east, then went below to check on the refugees. They were terrified, but intact. No one hit. 43 people huddled together in the cramped hold, that stank of fish guts and diesel fuel and human fear. Feretta was with Yosef. The old man's breathing was shallow, his skin burning hot. He needed a doctor and antibiotics they didn't have. Maybe he'd make it to the rendezvous. Maybe he wouldn't. Shimron climbed back on deck and pulled out a handheld radio, sending a prearranged sequence of clicks. Package en route. Encountered resistance. Continuing to rendezvous. He waited for a response. Protocol said 30 seconds. 72 seconds passed before the radio clicked back. Message received. Vessel in position. Shimron let out a breath. Ferretti stood beside him, looking back at the coast. He'd grown up in a village called Wolaka in northern Ethiopia, part of an ancient Jewish community isolated for 2,500 years. Now, he was on a smuggling dhow at 3:51 in the morning, heading toward a country he'd never seen, but had been taught to call home. Shimron asked how many more were waiting in the camps. Ferretti gave a number that made Shimron's stomach drop. Maybe 8,000, possibly 10,000. New refugees were arriving from Ethiopia every week, fleeing persecution and famine. Everyone in those camps knew that getting to Israel was their only chance. The numbers were impossible. At their current rate, it would take 16 years. They didn't have 16 years. 57 minutes after leaving the beach, Shimron saw lights on the horizon, an Israeli Navy missile boat holding station at the designated coordinates. 22 minutes later, they were alongside, and sailors were helping refugees climb aboard, while a medic went straight to Yosef. Lieutenant Dror More met Shimron at the top of the ladder. Shimron told him about the military patrol, the gunfire, the near miss. Dror mentioned something that made Shimron's blood run cold. Egyptian Air Force radar had tracked an unidentified vessel 42 minutes ago. They'd vectored a Mirage fighter, but called it off when the vessel entered international waters. So the Egyptians knew something was happening. They hadn't interdicted tonight, but they were watching. The next extraction would be harder, maybe impossible. But Shimron knew what suspension meant: refugees stuck in camps where people were dying every day from preventable diseases. The Navy vessel turned northwest. Shimron watched the eastern horizon, where Sudan lay beyond the curve of the earth. This operation was supposed to be simple, but nothing was simple anymore. Feretta asked the question Shimron had been avoiding: what happens when beach extractions become too dangerous to continue? Shimron didn't have a good answer, but there was an idea forming. Something about using a permanent base on the Sudanese coast instead of relying on beach extractions, a base that looked legitimate. A place where refugees could be brought in small groups and extracted without arousing suspicion every time. Establishing a permanent Israeli intelligence presence inside Sudan. A country at war with Israel, where being caught would mean execution. It sounded insane. But after tonight, after watching 43 refugees wade through dark water while soldiers fired at them, the insane idea was starting to sound like the only viable option left. By 0913, they docked at Eilat. Shimron had made a decision. He'd pitch the permanent base idea and volunteer to run it himself. 3 hours later, he was in a conference room in Tel Aviv, briefing intelligence officers about the growing problems with beach extractions. He explained the military patrol, the Egyptian surveillance, the increasing risk profile. Then he laid out the alternative: a permanent base with cover so solid it could operate openly for years. Ephraim Halavi, who ran covert operations for the Mossad, asked the obvious question: what kind of cover could justify an Israeli presence inside a country that wanted every Israeli dead? Shimron delivered the pitch. They'd buy a hotel, a diving resort catering to European tourists. They'd staff it with operatives posing as managers and instructors. They'd actually run it as a real business, and underneath, they'd use it as a staging point for refugee extractions. After 43 seconds of silence, an intelligence officer pointed out the problems. The cost would be enormous, the security nearly impossible to maintain, and if caught, the diplomatic fallout would be catastrophic. Shimron agreed with all of that and asked what the alternative was. Halavi stood and walked to the window. After 92 seconds, he turned back. They'd do it, but with conditions, strictly compartmentalized. no more than 12 people knowing the full scope. The resort would have to be financially self-sustaining within 12 months. And if anything went wrong, the government would deny all involvement, and the operatives would be completely deniable. Shimron accepted the terms, budget approved, resources allocated. The most audacious Israeli intelligence operation in a decade was green-lit, while outside the window ordinary people went about their ordinary lives. After reviewing 47 potential sites, Shimron found what he was looking for, a property near Marsa Height, 43 kilometers north of Port Sudan, perfect in its mediocrity. 30 rooms, small restaurant, dive shop unused for 3 years, isolated enough to bring refugees through the desert, close enough to Port Sudan that supply runs wouldn't seem suspicious. He assembled a core team of 6 operatives. Rachel Meyerson, 28, born in Switzerland, fluent in German and French, hotel management trained. Yoni Katzir, 31, former Sayeret Matkal commando, spoke English with a British accent. David Cohen, 34, accountant with MBA from Wharton, all experienced in hostile territory operations, all willing to sign on for years with high probability of capture or death. While the team trained, Shimron flew to Geneva to establish the Shell Company, Arouse Touring and Diving. Its financing was structured through enough layers that tracking the money to Tel Aviv would require forensic accounting the Sudanese government didn't have. The property purchase went through in March 1980. By April, the team was in Sudan, renovating and establishing themselves as legitimate owners. They told anyone who asked they were attracted by pristine coral reefs and lack of development. Sudan was the next great diving destination. The resort reopened in June as the Arus Holiday Village. Tourists came, Germans mostly, some Swiss, a few French. The team ran the hotel exactly as trained. Money from paying guests covered 63% of operating costs, crucial for the cover. But running a real resort complicated the covert mission. Refugees couldn't be brought in when tourists were around. Every operational decision had to be filtered through whether it would compromise the cover. In September 1980, they ran their first extraction from the resort. 12 refugees brought in after dark, hidden in storage buildings, loaded onto diving boats for the trip to international waters. The operation went perfectly. By the end of 1980, they'd extracted 43 refugees and were developing procedures for increasing that number. But the situation in the camps was deteriorating faster than they could respond. Famine was spreading. The camps were overwhelmed. People were dying at rates that made the extraction numbers look insignificant. Shimron filed reports requesting additional resources. The response was always the same. Maintain the cover first, extraction operations second. Under no circumstances risk exposing the mission. Rachel told Shimron in December she wasn't sure how much longer she could maintain the performance. The gap between who she was pretending to be and what she was actually doing was becoming harder to manage. Shimron told her what he told himself every morning. The performance was the mission. If they couldn't maintain the illusion, everything would fail, and people would die. By early 1981, the resort had been operating 9 months with excellent legitimacy. But the covert operation was straining. Tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews were now in the camps. The pressure to increase extractions was intense. Then, in March, a journalist from a Swiss newspaper showed up asking questions that made it clear he suspected something. Hans Müller claimed to be writing a travel feature, but his questions were specific. Why would a Swiss company invest in Sudan when most European businesses were pulling out? Any connections to Middle Eastern political interests? Rachel maintained her cover perfectly, but reported the conversation within 3 minutes. Shimron ran Müller's credentials. What came back was concerning. His recent articles showed unusual interest in intelligence operations and covert activities in Africa. The team had limited options, none good. They decided to play perfect hosts and hope Müller got bored and left without writing anything compromising. For 5 days they treated him like royalty. Müller seemed to be buying it. But on the 4th night, Yoni saw a light in Müller's window at 3:17 in the morning, steady for 20 minutes. Mueller was sitting at his window watching the courtyard below, where they staged refugees before extractions. They made the decision that Mueller had to leave immediately. The next morning, Rachel apologized. They'd accidentally double-booked his room. They needed him to check out early. Mueller accepted without protest. They watched him depart with mixed feelings. 3 weeks passed with no article. But then Shimron received word that Mueller had been in contact with Sudanese security services, sharing information about suspicious European businesses. The team suspended all extractions for 2 weeks. After heightened vigilance with no detected surveillance, they resumed on a limited basis, one group every 2 weeks instead of weekly. But the incident revealed a fundamental vulnerability. They were dependent on maintaining a cover that could be blown by one observant journalist, one curious guest, one piece of bad luck. The philosophical tension between operational security and humanitarian urgency was tearing at the team. Rachel developed insomnia. Yoni became increasingly aggressive. David started drinking heavily. In August 1981, a massive cholera outbreak swept through the camps, killing hundreds in weeks. Faraday reported that entire families were being wiped out, children dying of dehydration faster than aid workers could treat them. The team made a decision that violated protocols, but felt morally necessary. They'd conduct emergency extractions at higher frequency for the next month, targeting families with young children. They'd accept the increased risk. Shimron sent a message to Tel Aviv, not a request for permission, but notification of action already decided. The response came back harsh within 4 hours. They were ordered to stand down, return to standard protocols, stop making operational decisions based on emotion. Disobedience would result in immediate recall. Shimron asked for a vote, follow orders or ignore Tel Aviv, and run the emergency extractions anyway. The vote was unanimous. They'd run the operations. Over 4 weeks, they conducted 12 operations, moving 96 refugees to safety. Most were families with children under 10. The pace was brutal and the risk exponentially higher. Every team member was operating on minimal sleep and maximum stress. The miracle was they got away with it. No guests reported anything. No authorities asked questions. Shimron expected orders for immediate recall and prosecution. What he received instead was a brief communication from Halavi himself. 3 sentences. The operation was being redesignated from intelligence collection to humanitarian extraction. All previous restrictions were lifted. Do whatever was necessary while maintaining minimum viable cover. The message represented complete reversal. Prime Minister Begin had personally intervened, declaring that saving Ethiopian Jews took priority over intelligence doctrine. With the policy change came additional resources, more boats, more funding, additional operatives. The resort's capacity was expanded with temporary structures behind the main complex. By the end of 1981, they'd extracted over 300 refugees. The operation was running at a pace that seemed sustainable. For the first time, Shimron felt like they were making a meaningful impact. But success brought complications. The Ethiopian Jewish community had figured out the resort was an extraction point. Refugees were making their way toward the coast in larger numbers than the operation could handle. Operational security was degrading as more people knew the secret. In January 1982, they got concrete indication the secret was spreading beyond control. A new refugee mentioned he'd been told about the extraction point by someone who'd heard from someone else. The intelligence was traveling through informal networks, spreading like an underground legend. There's a hotel on the coast run by Europeans who will help you get to Israel. Through early 1982, extractions continued at increased pace. The resort was moving an average of 30 refugees per week. Over 1,000 people extracted since the operation began. But routine was dangerous. Shimron drilled this constantly. They couldn't afford to relax. Every extraction needed to be planned as if it were the first. By summer 1982, the team had been operating for over 2 years. The psychological toll was becoming severe. Rachel had developed a tremor in her hands. Yoni had become increasingly withdrawn. David's drinking had progressed from coping mechanism to dependency. In September, a routine extraction nearly went catastrophic when a diving boat experienced engine failure halfway to the rendezvous. The boat was dead in the water, with 23 refugees aboard. It took 6 hours to transfer them and tow the boat back. 6 hours drifting in open water. If Egyptian forces had found that disabled boat packed with refugees being towed by an Israeli Navy vessel, the diplomatic incident would have exposed everything. They'd gotten lucky. But luck wasn't a strategy, and eventually it would run out. By the end of 1982, they'd extracted over 1,500 refugees. But maintaining operations was becoming harder as security conditions deteriorated. The new year brought a military coup in Khartoum that replaced the secular government with an Islamic-oriented regime more hostile to Western presence. Increased security measures, more patrols, more checkpoints, more scrutiny of foreign businesses. In February 1983, those questions arrived. Colonel Ahmed Suleiman, a Sudanese military intelligence officer, appeared at the resort at 11:43 and requested a meeting. He was 47, educated at Cairo University, spoke perfect English, and had a reputation for being methodical and impossible to deceive. Suleiman's questions started with financial details. Shimron had prepared answers, fabricated statements showing a sustainable business model. Then Suleiman shifted to operational questions harder to answer convincingly. His questions revealed he'd been conducting surveillance, watching their patterns, looking for inconsistencies. Then Suleiman asked a question that made Shimron's blood freeze. Had the resort ever been approached by people seeking transportation to other countries? Perhaps refugees looking to leave Sudan illegally? A trap question. Shimron chose a middle path. He acknowledged refugees sometimes approached asking for help, but the staff always refused and directed them to authorities. Suleiman made a note and stood to leave. He thanked Shimron and mentioned that military intelligence would continue monitoring. The message was clear. They were being watched, and any suspicious behavior would trigger investigation. The team assessed that Suleiman's visit was a critical escalation, but not necessarily terminal. He was suspicious, but didn't have proof. They could probably continue if they tightened security further, but the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. Through March and April 1983, they continued with significantly enhanced security that cut extraction capacity by nearly half. But the alternative was getting caught, which would end the mission permanently. In May, the famine in Ethiopia intensified dramatically, triggering a mass exodus. The camps swelled to hold tens of thousands. The humanitarian crisis was evolving from severe to catastrophic. Faraday reported the refugee population might exceed 50,000. They'd extracted nearly 2,000 over 3 years, less than 5%. At their current pace, they'd need decades. Most didn't have decades to wait. In June, Suleiman made another unannounced visit at 1427. This time his questions were more pointed and his demeanor less friendly. He'd received reports that Ethiopian nationals had been seen near the resort. Local fishermen claimed to have observed the boats operating at unusual hours. Shimron invited Suleiman to inspect the facility. Suleiman spent 3 hours touring, asking questions, taking notes. He interviewed Rachel and Yoni. Both maintained their cover despite the stress. He examined the diving boats and noted they had significantly more fuel capacity than necessary for typical diving excursions. By the end, Suleiman hadn't found anything concrete, but his suspicions were undiminished. He told Shimron military intelligence would maintain close observation. Any irregularities would result in immediate investigation and potential closure. After Suleiman left, the team assessed they were operating on borrowed time measured in weeks or months rather than years. Eventually, he'd find something or someone would make a mistake. They reported this to Tel Aviv and recommended beginning preparations for emergency shutdown. Headquarters ordered them to continue until shutdown became absolutely necessary. The political pressure to maximize rescue was overwhelming security concerns. The team continued operating through summer 1983, knowing every extraction might be the last. The psychological pressure was crushing. maintaining the cover while preparing for emergency evacuation, smiling at guests while wondering if military intelligence was watching from the hills. In August, they extracted 43 refugees in a single operation, the largest ever attempted, and a desperate effort to move as many as possible before the window closed. The operation went smoothly, technically, but it was reckless and visible in ways earlier operations hadn't been. 2 days later, Shimron received word that Sudanese intelligence was requesting additional information about the resort's ownership from Swiss authorities. Suleiman was digging deeper, trying to trace the corporate entities back to their actual funding sources. The team implemented the emergency evacuation plan. Encrypted equipment was destroyed with thermite grenades, documents burned, computer hard drives smashed and dumped into the sea. But the arrest never came. Suleiman's investigation hit a dead end in Switzerland. Without concrete proof, he couldn't justify moving against the resort. They stood down from emergency status, but remained on high alert. In November, a fishing boat captain contracted for several extractions was arrested on unrelated smuggling charges. He knew enough to compromise them if he decided to trade information for leniency. 3 days of waiting produced no arrest warrants or raids, suggesting he hadn't revealed anything. By December 1983, they'd operated 3.5 years and extracted over 2,500 refugees. The number should have felt like an achievement. Instead, it felt like a drop against a flood. The new year of 1984 began with smooth extractions, suggesting maybe they could continue indefinitely if careful and lucky. But luck was a finite resource. They'd been drawing on it heavily for 3.5 years. In January, Yoni reported surveillance teams positioned in the hills with optical equipment observing the property. Sudanese intelligence was conducting systematic surveillance. Operations were suspended 2 weeks. When they resumed, it was under conditions that made every mission feel like it might trigger the final collapse. In March 1984, the dreaded situation materialized. A German photographer named Klaus Bergmann witnessed part of a refugee extraction when he couldn't sleep and went for a walk at 0 to 2:47. Bergmann confronted Shimron the next morning, not with accusations, but with questions. Whether the resort was involved in human trafficking or refugee smuggling. Whether he should report what he'd seen, Shimron made a calculation that would determine whether the operation survived. He told Bergmann the truth. The resort was helping Ethiopian refugees escape persecution, moving them to safety. It was politically sensitive and depended on secrecy. Revealing it would condemn thousands to die in camps. Bergmann asked why it had to be secret if it was justified. Why not done openly through official channels? Shimron didn't have a good answer beyond the truth. The countries involved didn't want these refugees. Covert operations were the only option for people who would otherwise be abandoned. Bergmann thought for a long moment and made a decision that probably saved the operation. He'd keep the secret. He wouldn't report what he'd seen, and he'd leave immediately to remove himself as a security risk. They shook hands. Bergmann checked out at 11:37. Days passed without incident, then weeks. Eventually, they concluded Bergmann had kept the secret. They'd survived another close call through luck and the decency of a stranger. But the incident was a stark reminder of how fragile the security had become. One person seeing something at the wrong time could end everything. In April 1984, headquarters sent a directive: begin preparing for permanent shutdown within 6 months. The window was closing. Attempting to operate beyond would risk not just the mission, but everyone's lives. The 6-month timeline created brutal urgency. Every day that passed was one day less to extract refugees. The team pushed harder than ever, running extractions at a pace that violated every security protocol. Through April and May, they extracted over 200 refugees, bringing the total to nearly 3,000. The number represented both achievement and failure. 3,000 lives saved was significant, but less than 10% of refugees in Sudan. In early June, the intelligence picture deteriorated when a separate Israeli operation in Djibouti was compromised. It triggered increased scrutiny of all foreign activities in Sudan. Suleiman's investigation intensified immediately. More frequent visits, more aggressive questioning. Surveillance no longer attempting to hide. Headquarters ordered them to continue for 2 more weeks. The decision was driven by political pressure, officials willing to risk operatives' lives to save additional refugees. The team implemented endgame protocol, extraction operations with minimal security, maximum speed, accepting that every operation might trigger arrest. During the 2-week endgame, they extracted 163 refugees, bringing the total over 3,000. But everyone knew they were operating on borrowed time measured in days. On June 23 at 1642, Shimron received word that Sudanese military forces were planning to raid the resort within 48 hours. 2 trucks of soldiers scheduled to arrive June 26th, with orders to arrest all staff and seize all records. They had less than 2 days to evacuate and disappear. The team activated the emergency evacuation plan. Encrypted equipment was destroyed with thermite grenades at 1723. Documents burned, hard drives smashed and dumped offshore. Every piece of evidence systematically destroyed over 12 hours. The evacuation was a staged withdrawal. Team members would leave individually over 36 hours, using different routes and cover stories. Rachel left first at 0547 on June 24th. Yoni left at 0927 by boat. David and others departed at 1353. One by one, the team dissolved and dispersed. Shimron would be the last to leave. By the morning of June 24th, he was alone except for 2 local employees, Ahmed and Hassan, kitchen workers with no knowledge of the operations. He gave them their wages plus $500 each, far in excess of what was owed. He told them the resort was closing due to financial problems. They left at 0837. 2 ordinary men who'd worked at a hotel without knowing they'd been part of one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the Cold War. Then, Shimron conducted a final sweep. He found a notebook with operational notes in Hebrew in a desk drawer. He burned it. He found a satellite phone taped under a table. He smashed it. Behind a filing cabinet, he found passport photos of refugees. He tore them up and scattered them into the water. By noon, the resort was empty and cleaned of anything directly connecting it to Israeli intelligence. Shimron's escape route was by boat at 1400. The diving boat was fueled and ready. He started the engine at 1353 and pulled away at 1357 without looking back. The transit took 93 minutes. Shimron spent it thinking about the final accounting. 3,072 refugees extracted, 0 operatives lost, 4 years of continuous operation in hostile territory. By any objective measure, a success, but it felt like failure because of all the people they hadn't saved. The Israeli Navy vessel appeared at 1529, exactly on schedule. 37 minutes later, Shimron was aboard, and the diving boat was being scuttled. The last physical evidence disappeared beneath the waves. Lieutenant Dror Morey briefed Shimron. Sudanese military had raided the resort at 0743 on June 26th, 40 hours after Shimron's departure. They found an abandoned facility with no personnel and no obvious evidence. Suleiman had been furious that his suspects had disappeared. He'd spent 6 hours searching, finding nothing conclusive. The Sudanese government issued diplomatic protests, claiming the resort had been a front for Israeli intelligence, but without concrete proof, they couldn't escalate beyond formal complaints. The operation had ended the way most intelligence operations ended, not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet withdrawal, leaving behind questions and suspicions, but no definitive proof. Shimron arrived in Eilat at 2347 and was transported to Tel Aviv for debriefing. The rest of the team arrived over following days through various routes. Everyone made it out safely. A minor miracle given how close they'd come to being caught. The team reunion on July 2nd was subdued rather than celebratory. They'd saved 3,000 lives, but they'd left behind tens of thousands who would continue dying in camps with no rescue pipeline available. Ephraim Halavi met with the team on July 5th. The operation was being classified at the highest levels, all records sealed, all participants bound by secrecy agreements. The rescued refugees would be told to maintain silence. Halavi informed them the operation had achieved its strategic objectives beyond just extraction numbers. The successful rescue had demonstrated Israeli commitment and built trust that would facilitate future operations. It had also provided valuable intelligence about refugee routes and camp conditions. But Halavi acknowledged what everyone understood. The operation had barely scratched the surface. New approaches would be needed. The team was offered next assignments. Some accepted, continuing their intelligence careers. Others chose to leave entirely, burned out by 4 years of constant stress. Rachel took a position training new operatives. Yoni disappeared into another classified operation. He'd be killed 3 years later in circumstances never fully explained. David entered rehabilitation for operational trauma and alcohol dependency. Shimron stayed with the Mossad, but moved into planning roles. He couldn't discuss what he'd done in Sudan with anyone outside the small circle read into the operation. Over following months, he learned what happened to the resort. Sudanese authorities seized the property and conducted forensic investigation, finding traces but nothing constituting definitive proof. Suleiman compiled a report detailing his suspicions, but without harder proof, the government couldn't pursue formal charges. The resort sat abandoned before being sold to a businessman who planned to renovate. But renovations never happened. The property slowly deteriorated. Local residents told stories about the mysterious Europeans, embellishing tales until truth became indistinguishable from fiction. In October 1984, Shimron was called to a meeting at the Prime Minister's office. Prime Minister Shamir thanked him personally, acknowledging that while details would remain classified, the impact would be remembered by those who knew the truth. Shamir revealed something Shimron hadn't known. The diving resort extractions had been part of a larger, coordinated effort involving multiple Israeli operations, diplomatic pressure, and covert negotiations. The resort had been one component of a multi-year campaign. Individual operations had been compartmentalized for security, but all coordinated toward the same goal. This reframed everything. The operation hadn't been an isolated effort, but one piece of a much larger puzzle involving hundreds of officers, diplomats, military personnel, and political leaders. In November 1984, the larger operation came to fruition, Operation Moses, a massive airlift that evacuated approximately 7,000 Ethiopian Jews from Sudan over 6 weeks. The airlift was conducted with covert cooperation of Sudanese authorities convinced through diplomatic pressure and financial incentives. Israeli C-130 Hercules cargo planes flew into a Sudanese airbase under cover of darkness. Loaded refugees transported from camps flew them directly to Israel. Operation Moses accomplished in 6 weeks what the diving resort had taken 4 years to achieve. But Moses was only possible because operations like the resort had paved the way, building the infrastructure and trust that made a large-scale airlift feasible. The Moses airlift was exposed by media reports in early January 1985, forcing premature end. But by that point, over 8,000 Ethiopian Jews had been rescued through the combination of the diving resort, Operation Moses, and smaller operations. The numbers represented perhaps 20% of the Ethiopian Jewish population that had fled to Sudan. Thousands more remained in camps after the extraction pipeline collapsed. In following years, Shimron occasionally received updates about refugees he'd helped extract. Most had successfully integrated into Israeli society. Some of the children who'd been carried through dark water had grown up to become soldiers, doctors, teachers, artists. They were living proof the operation had mattered. That 4 years of stress and danger had produced tangible results in actual human lives preserved and futures created. But he also heard about refugees who hadn't made it out, who'd died in camps while waiting. The moral weight of those decisions, who got extracted and who didn't, who lived and who died based on timing and logistics and luck, was something Shimron carried long after the operation ended. In later years, when the operation was declassified, people would ask whether the mission had been worth it, whether saving 3,000 justified 4 years of risk and moral compromise. He never had a simple answer. The arithmetic was brutal: 3,000 saved versus tens of thousands not saved. But he always came back to the same truth. Every single one of those 3,000 was alive because of the operation. Their children and grandchildren would exist because the team had chosen to act. The full story remained classified for over 30 years. In 2011, Shimron published a book revealing portions of the story, breaking decades of silence. The book provided broad outlines but left out many details that remained classified. The public revelation triggered mixed reactions. Some praised it as a heroic humanitarian mission. Others criticized the deception involved. But the people whose opinions mattered most, the rescued refugees, were nearly unanimous in their gratitude. Faraday spoke publicly about what the resort had meant. It had been more than just an extraction point. It had been proof that someone cared, that they hadn't been forgotten, that their connection to Israel was valued enough that people would risk their lives. Shimron attended a reunion of rescued refugees in 2015. The event was held on June 23rd, exactly 31 years after the final evacuation, attended by 473 people. The reunion was emotionally overwhelming. He met adults who'd been children during extractions. They introduced him to their own children, born in Israel decades after the rescue, existence made possible by the operation's success. One woman approached him with a story that crystallized everything. She'd been 8 years old during her extraction in September 1982. Her father had died in the camps. Her mother had been ill with typhoid fever and barely conscious during the boat journey. The woman, now 39, a physician at Hadassah Hospital, remembered Shimron carrying her mother onto the boat. Her mother had survived and lived for another 23 years in Jerusalem. Her younger siblings had become successful adults with families of their own. None of it would have existed without that night on the Red Sea. Shimron listened to her story and dozens of others, personal accounts that transformed abstract statistics into specific human realities. The operation hadn't saved everyone, but it had saved these people, and their survival mattered absolutely. Perfect solutions had never been available. The choice had been between partial success through desperate measures or complete failure through inaction. They'd chosen to act despite knowing the outcome would be incomplete. In 2019, the operation became the subject of a Hollywood film starring Chris Evans. The movie took creative liberties, compressing timelines and inventing characters. But it captured the essential truth: a small team running a fake resort as cover for saving lives in impossible circumstances. The film's release sparked renewed interest in the operation and in the broader history of Ethiopian Jewish immigration to Israel. Scholars began researching the Beta Israel community, documenting their ancient traditions and modern struggles. But even with public awareness, certain aspects remained classified and would likely never be fully revealed. The specific intelligence techniques, the identities of certain operatives, the details of diplomatic negotiations. Shimron retired from the Mossad in 1997 after 32 years spanning numerous operations. The diving resort mission remained the defining experience. Other missions had been more tactically complex, but none had combined the same elements of sustained deception, humanitarian purpose, and existential risk. In retirement, he occasionally lectured at intelligence training facilities, teaching about cover identity maintenance, operational security, and the psychological challenges of deep gotcha work. He used the diving resort as a case study. The lectures always included discussion of moral dimensions, the tension between operational objectives and humanitarian considerations. The resort mission had forced constant navigation of that tension, making daily decisions that balanced security against the imperative to save lives. Shimron emphasized that intelligence work often involved choosing between bad options rather than good ones, accepting incomplete solutions to complex problems, living with consequences of decisions made under uncertainty and pressure. Some former team members struggled more than others with the operation's legacy. Rachel had left intelligence work entirely, unable to maintain the psychological compartmentalization required. She'd undergone years of therapy and eventually built a successful career in academia, teaching Middle Eastern studies at Tel Aviv University. Yoni had continued in covert operations for another decade, but the accumulated stress eventually manifested as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He was killed in 1994 in Beirut under circumstances never fully explained. He'd helped save thousands of lives, but the psychological cost had been severe and permanent. David had overcome his alcohol dependency through treatment, but never returned to operational duty. He'd retrained as a therapist specializing in trauma counseling for intelligence personnel. He spoke frankly about how the resort mission had broken something inside him. The operation's long-term impact on the Ethiopian Jewish community was complex. The rescued refugees faced significant challenges integrating into Israeli society: cultural differences, economic marginalization, discrimination. The diving resort had saved their lives, but it hadn't solved the broader problems of integration that would take generations to address. In 2020, 40 years after the operation began, surviving team members and rescued refugees gathered for another reunion. The event was smaller. Age and geography limited participation. But the connections remained strong. Bonds created through shared risk and shared purpose. Shimron attended, knowing it might be the last time. He was 78 now, slowed by age but still sharp in memory. The operation that had consumed 4 years of his life 4 decades earlier remained vivid. Specific faces, conversations, moments that had defined the experience. During the reunion, a young woman approached. Sarah Yosef, the granddaughter of a refugee he'd extracted in August 1983. She was 22, a medical student at Hebrew University, born 20 years after her grandmother's rescue, part of a generation that had grown up with freedom and opportunities the operation had made possible. She wanted to thank him personally for giving her family a future, for making decisions under impossible circumstances that preserved lives and created possibilities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Shimron accepted her thanks, but found himself thinking about thousands of other potential granddaughters who'd never been born, who'd died in camps or during failed escape attempts. The operation's success was real and meaningful, but it existed alongside the much larger failure to save everyone who'd needed saving. Both truths were accurate simultaneously. The final revelation came when an elderly Ethiopian Israeli man named Desta Mariam approached. Desta was 73, part of the refugee network in Sudan during the early 1980s. He revealed that the refugee community had known about Suleiman's investigation far earlier than the Israeli team realized, and they'd deliberately fed misinformation to other refugees to protect the operation. Some had been told the resort was closed when it was operating. Families had been asked to wait additional weeks to spread out arrivals and make the operation less visible. This meant the Ethiopian refugees themselves had been active participants in the operation's security rather than passive recipients. They'd made their own calculations about risk and timing, accepting that some would be left behind temporarily to protect the pipeline, saving others. The diving resort operation hadn't been just an Israeli intelligence mission. It had been a collaborative effort between Israeli operatives and Ethiopian Jews working together toward a shared goal. The collaboration had never been formally coordinated because security prevented it, but it had existed nonetheless, organically developed through shared understanding of what was at stake. The refugees had protected the operation in ways the Israeli team never fully realized. Their protection had probably extended the mission's viability by months or even years. Shimron returned home with a different understanding. The operation hadn't been a simple story of agents rescuing passive victims. It had been a complex collaboration. The success had belonged to everyone involved, as had the failures and moral compromises. In his final years, Shimron occasionally received messages from people he'd helped extract, birthday greetings, updates about grandchildren and great-grandchildren whose existence traced back to those desperate nights on the Red Sea. Each message was a reminder that the operation's impact continued rippling forward through the time, creating lives and futures that multiplied across generations. The mathematics of rescue looked different when measured across decades. 3,000 people extracted in the 1980s had become 10,000 descendants by the 2020s. Those 10,000 would become 30,000 by mid-century. The operation's legacy wasn't just measured in people saved, but in all the lives that followed from that salvation. The Arouse holiday village itself was demolished in the late 1990s, the buildings torn down. A luxury resort now occupies the site, catering to wealthy tourists who have no idea what happened there 4 decades earlier. The physical location disappeared, but the operation's legacy persisted in ways that transcended physical locations. It demonstrated that covert intelligence operations could serve humanitarian purposes, that the tools of espionage could be redirected towards saving lives rather than just gathering secrets. The model influenced later rescue missions and humanitarian interventions, providing proof that small teams operating under deep cover could accomplish things official channels couldn't achieve. The operation also revealed the psychological costs of sustained deception and the moral complexity of humanitarian work conducted through intelligence methods. The team members carried lasting scars from years maintaining false identities while watching people die from problems they couldn't solve fast enough. The ethical questions about who got rescued and who didn't, about which lives were saved at what cost, persisted long after and could never be fully resolved. In the final accounting, the Red Sea diving resort operation succeeded in its immediate goal of extracting several thousand Ethiopian Jews from Sudan during a critical period when other rescue methods weren't available. It failed in its broader aspiration to solve the humanitarian crisis facing the entire Ethiopian Jewish community. Both the success and the failure were real and important. Understanding the operation required holding both truths simultaneously without diminishing either. The story eventually became part of a larger historical narrative about the Beta Israel community's journey from Ethiopia to Israel, a journey that had begun centuries earlier and continued through modern rescue operations. Shimron died in 2023 at age 78. His obituary in Haaretz mentioned the mission prominently, describing it as one of the most remarkable intelligence operations in Israeli history and one of the most effective humanitarian rescue missions of the Cold War era. Former team members and rescued refugees attended his funeral in Jerusalem, gathering to honor a man who'd dedicated 4 years to an impossible mission and carried the weight of its successes and failures for the rest of his days. Rachel spoke at the funeral, her voice steady despite the emotion. She talked about what it had meant to work alongside Shimron for 4 years, to maintain impossible deceptions under impossible pressure, to make impossible choices about impossible situations. Farida also spoke, now 62, a grandfather, a professor of Ethiopian studies at Hebrew University, a bridge between 2 cultures and histories. He talked about what Shimron had meant to the Ethiopian Jewish community, not just as the man who'd run the operation, but as a symbol of commitment, of the promise that they wouldn't be forgotten. The diving resort operation remained unique in intelligence history. A sustained covert mission that ran 4 years under hostile surveillance, maintained elaborate cover as a functioning business, and successfully evacuated over 3,000 people without losing a single operative to capture or death. The technical achievement was remarkable, but what made it historically significant was its demonstration that intelligence capabilities could be applied to humanitarian purposes, that the same tradecraft used for espionage could be redirected toward saving lives. The lessons continued to influence Israeli intelligence doctrine and international humanitarian operations decades after. But the deeper lessons about moral complexity and impossible choices and psychological costs were harder to teach, except through direct experience. The story of the Red Sea diving resort ended where it began, with people making desperate choices in desperate circumstances, trying to save as many lives as possible while knowing they couldn't save everyone, accepting incomplete success because complete failure was unacceptable. The operation's legacy wasn't just the 3,000 rescued, or the tradecraft demonstrated, or the historical significance. The legacy was the affirmation that individual choices mattered, that small teams could accomplish significant things against overwhelming odds, that attempting the impossible sometimes succeeded even when success looked inadequate, measured against the problem's scale. The Ethiopian Jews who passed through the fake diving resort went on to build lives in Israel their ancestors could hardly have imagined. Lives made possible by operatives who'd chosen to risk everything for people they'd never met and maintained their commitment through 4 years of fear and doubt and moral complexity. Those lives continued forward, generating new generations and new stories that spread far beyond the original rescue operation. And in that continuation, in those lives lived and those futures created, the operation achieved its truest and most lasting success, not in statistics of people extracted or missions completed, but in the simple fact of human survival and human possibility preserved against the odds. The final word belongs to Sarah Yosef, the medical student who'd thanked Shimron at the 2020 reunion. She wrote an essay for an Israeli news website in 2023 after his death, reflecting on what the diving resort operation had meant to her family and to her personally. She wrote about her grandmother, who'd been 26 when she waded through dark water toward a boat in the middle of the night, who'd been sick with typhoid fever, but survived the journey and lived to see her granddaughter become a doctor. She wrote about the mathematics of survival, how one extraction operation 40 years ago created a cascade of consequences that led to her existence, her education, her future children who would never know how close they'd come to never being born. She wrote about the weight that Shimron and his team had carried, the impossible decisions about who got saved and who didn't, the moral complexity of choosing between bad options when no good options existed. And she wrote about gratitude, not just personal gratitude for her family's salvation, but broader gratitude for the principle the operation represented. That when faced with impossible situations, some people choose to act rather than accept the impossibility. That imperfect rescue is better than perfect abandonment. That 3,000 lives saved matters even when tens of thousands weren't saved. The essay ended with a line that captured the operation's essential truth better than any intelligence report or historical analysis ever could. They didn't save everyone, but they saved us, and that makes all the difference.